So Halloween weekend was a big weekend for me. I managed to see 3 of my most anticipated movies of the entire year. These 3 films are each made by one of my favorite directors of all time, who each have made at least one of my favorite movies of all time, including Prisoners, Baby Driver, Fantastic Mr. Fox, and more. I'm going to give you a brief review of Last Night in Soho, The French Dispatch, and Dune, without getting into any spoilers because these are all movies I recommend seeing. First up is Edgar Wright's newest film, Last Night in Soho. For a while, I've considered Edgar Wright to be my favorite director of all time, probably up there with like David Fincher, just because every film he's put out I've thoroughly enjoyed. So for that reason alone, this was my most anticipated movie the entire year, and I went into it with very little prior knowledge or having read any reviews or anything because I wanted to be very surprised. I hate to say that I was disappointed with this movie because I still really enjoyed it, but it really wasn't what I was expecting at all. Going into one of Edgar Wright's films, you're expecting to see his distinct style shine through, as it does in every genre, with his quick, snappy editing and super witty dialogue. Last Night in Soho is much different than his other films, which is kind of a good thing because it shows he's able to step outside of his comfort zone and do something different, but it's also kind of disappointing for me personally because I really like the typical flair of an Edgar Wright film. The first 2/3 are very stylized when we see this 60s dream world full of mirrors and shifting reflections. This part of the movie did a great job pulling me into this world and making me want to find out so much more and find out what this whole mystery is about. The performances by the 2 main leads are both very compelling and they do a great job, although some of the side characters are very underdeveloped and one note. For a horror movie, it was actually very unsettling, and I like that the approach to the scares was actually pretty unique, but the ending is so generic, and that's where most of my disappointment stems from with this film. It felt like anyone could have written this ending, whereas his other films like Hot Fuzz or Scott Pilgrim, they feel distinctly like Edgar Wright, and no one else could have made something like that. Most of this movie feels very different from other modern horror films, and I really like that about it, especially with the way it tackles heavy subject matter like sexual assault and harassment. So I'm gonna give Last Night in Soho an 8 out of 10. Unlike Last Night in Soho, The French Dispatch feels exactly like what you'd expect from a Wes Anderson movie. My favorite thing about Wes Anderson's style is the way that he's able to portray other mediums of storytelling in his films. There are multiple beautiful looking animated segments, and there's also a couple that are shot in a way that make them resemble stop motion, which is really cool looking. But my favorite example of this has to be the scenes where everyone in the frame stays completely still like a photograph, but with the small, subtle movements of film. The story itself is told through the narration of newspaper articles, each with its own separate, distinct stories. The characters are flamboyant and dramatic, which makes these seemingly straightforward stories have so much character. Every cast member has their moment in the spotlight with some very impressive monologues by Tilda Swinton, Frances McDormand, and Jeffrey Wright. My favorite performance has to either be Timothée Chalamet or Adrien Brody because both of these characters are just so ridiculously silly and lead to some of the most hilarious moments in the movie. I also went into this movie with very little prior knowledge, and I was pleasantly surprised by just how funny this movie was. I think this is easily the most I've laughed in a theater all year, and I loved how well this subtle situational humor worked together with Wes Anderson's unique filmmaking techniques. I'm going to give The French Dispatch a 9 out of 10, and I have to say that this is in my top 3 movies of the year so far. I've owned Dune, the book, for about a year now, and I'm still only about 15 pages into it. It's a very challenging story to get into because just the sheer scope of its narrative. So going into the film, I was really worried about getting completely lost, especially after some of the initial reviews I heard of it. But I'm happy to say that Dune left me in a state of complete awe. The story and scale of this movie are completely captivating, and it's just unlike anything I've ever seen before. It's fascinating how a movie can feel so massive yet so intimate at the same time. It's similar to another one of Denis Villeneuve's films, Blade Runner 2049, in the way that it uses these graceful, establishing shots to show us so much about these worlds visually. Villeneuve's films are very different from each other in content, but he always does a great job of introducing us to these expansive worlds, or in other cases, the world of our character's mind. The music in all three of these films was used brilliantly, but especially in Dune, because the music feels like it's just as important for the world building as the visuals or the exposition. The cast is huge, but they all bring so much to the table. My favorite was probably Jason Momoa's character, just because he was so much fun to watch on screen. But I also really liked Rebecca Ferguson's character, Lady Jessica, because of the way that she's trying to balance these two parts of her family while also helping Paul to become what he's destined to be. I've always been a big fan of science fiction, and I think putting a story like this into the hands of such a talented director makes this feel like the perfect mix between a big action blockbuster and complex artistic expression in film. Even if this is your first experience with the story of Dune, it's so easy to get sucked into this world, and I found it really easy to understand, and it's really made me want to try reading the book again. I'm going to give Dune a 9 out of 10, and I would also say that this is in my top 3 films of the year, right behind The French Dispatch. I hope hearing my quick thoughts was enough to get you interested in these films, and I definitely recommend seeing all of them if you get the chance. As always, tell me what you thought about these movies if you saw them, and if there's anything else you'd like to see me talk about on this channel. But other than that, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.